Today we're back in the lab to review AMD's new Ryzen 7 5800X3D. That is in fact the name. This CPU has been in discussion for almost a year now. AMD has basically stacked an additional 64 megabytes of L3 cache on top of its existing 32 megabytes found in the 5800X, the original. And at the $450 MSRP price point for the X3D, it is launching at the same original price as the 5800X. That makes this particularly interesting right now because Intel just weeks ago rushed out the door its own response to this, its preemptive response, which was the 12900KS that we just bought for $800. So that's the competition that the 5800X3D is going up against. Today we're going to be benchmarking it. AMD has mostly been making claims about gaming, saying that this should be about 15% faster on average in games than the previous 5800X. Let's get started. Before that, this video is brought to you by Thermal Grizzly. Thermal Grizzly's Hydronaut and Cryonaut thermal pastes are high-performing thermal interfaces for use on CPUs and GPUs. You can bring an old card back to peak performance by repasting it and doing preventative maintenance, and Thermal Grizzly's Hydronaut is ideal for water cooling and air cooling for new and old cards alike. Cryonaut paste is one of the top-performing pastes for extreme overclocking with CPUs and GPUs, and has been used in several world record-scoring machines. Learn more at the link in the description below. So the approach AMD is taking here isn't quite the same as the Sega Genesis 32X, but it is a physical stacking of hardware to achieve an advanced version of an existing part. And the 5800X3D, it takes a piece of cache as a separate module that is stacking on top of the existing chiplets, or one of them, inside of the Ryzen 5800X. AMD is using a direct copper-to-copper bond to do this, and the end result is something that, after sanding some of the layers down on the 5800X3D, is the same Z height as the original 5800X, so it doesn't change the cooler requirements, doesn't change the way the socket works or the motherboard works at all. Everything works the same way, in spite of the fact that technically, there is an additional layer of silicon on top of the existing silicon that is in a 5800X non-3D. The 5800X3D's other specs include the same 8-core 16-thread configuration as the 5800X, but it drops in frequency to a claimed 4.5 GHz max boost and 3.4 GHz base. The 5800X claims 4.7 GHz max boost and 3.8 GHz base instead. So, the 5800X3D will not be better in frequency-dependent applications that care little for the additional layer of cache. The 5800X3D will launch on April 20th as well, so AMD is giving everyone 6 days to watch the reviews first, which is actually great and really rare because that allows people time to decide if they want to buy this before just rushing to try and grab whatever inventory is available. In terms of comparable CPUs, here's what it's fighting against. The original 5800X is now about $340, with the 5700X running at about $300. The 5800X launched at $450 as a reminder, and the X3D again is $450. The i9-12900K is about $600 right now, and we just bought that brand new 12900KS for $800. It's a little bit faster, but ouch. Intel clearly tried to rush this out the door before the X3D launched because it has to know that the value looks a little questionable here. The 12700K is about $384, and the 5900X is around $400. So that gives us the lineup of what's most interesting to compare to. The original idea for stacking cache on top of a Ryzen 5000 CPU came at the very end of an AMD keynote announcement, where it actually, even though it pre-briefed us and other media on that keynote in its entirety, the one thing it didn't tell anyone about was the stacked cache, or the Vcache version of the Ryzen 5000 CPUs. So it was kind of a wild card thrown out there almost as a gamble, especially because it's coming out right before Zen 4. So AMD is pushing this out as basically one of the last Ryzen AM4 socket CPUs that will ever be made, because after this, AM4 dies and it moves to AM5, Zen 4, and an LGA socket. It's going to be a big change, and that probably means there's not going to be a ton of these made because the lifespan will be relatively short, but it's an interesting drop-in socket replacement or final build for AM4 for people. In terms of expectations, AMD has been very clear that this is gaming focused. That's because of the cache. Cache will benefit certain code compile workloads. It will benefit a good amount of games, and things like Blender, so tile-based rendering, like Cinebench would represent the same thing, will not be benefited by extra cache. Premiere, for the most part, won't be benefited by it, and compression, decompression won't see a benefit either. So in scenarios where the 5800X's higher frequency would be more valuable than the increase in cache on the 5800X 3D, you will see the 5800X pull ahead of the X3D. That's not unexpected, just to get everyone primed on that up front. In areas where the core increase on the 5900X would be more valuable, like Blender, you'll obviously see that one pull ahead. So the X3D requires a little bit of knowledge about where you're planning to use it to get the most out of it, because it's not as simple as being a new best, just period and everything. In terms of the internal structure of this, it's actually pretty interesting to look at. AMD has some animations for this too, where the new L3 die with 64 megabytes of L3 cache extension is structurally supported as well, because the CCD has been thinned in order to accommodate the cache, again, without impacting that Z height and the cooler mount for existing solutions. AMD is using an approach it calls hybrid bonding to mount everything with a direct copper-to-copper interface that allows the slim form factor and the high-speed connection. Now, in terms of overclocking for this, strictly not allowed. So AMD has asked the motherboard vendors to disable the AMD frequency settings in BIOS and the AMD vCore setting in BIOS. Other stuff like memory and Infinity Fabric, you can still tune that, which arguably is the more important part of overclocking and tuning for Ryzen anyway. So potentially not a big loss other than in XOC competitions. The reasoning AMD has given publicly for this is saying that it's tuned for 1.35 volts, for the cache that is, and any more than that you risk damaging the die or getting into territory where they haven't done any validation. In speaking with motherboard manufacturers, we asked, could you just ignore AMD and leave it on? And the answer we got from one of the board partners was, well, we might be able to make a way for you to overclock it, but the risk is higher that there would be damage to the CPU. So that's why there's no overclocking here. Okay, enough of that. Let's get started with the benchmarks. Because of the lower expected boost on the 5800X 3D, we need to establish what to expect when the cache doesn't help, like some render workloads, for instance. Under an all-core workload, we logged the 5800X 3D at about 4300 to 4320 megahertz average all-core frequency. It didn't deviate much from the 4320 megahertz marker while under a 360 mil Arctic Liquid Freezer 2, and it produced overall a flat line. The R7 5800X we reviewed plotted at about 4600 megahertz for the same workload, and that's consistent throughout the test. This will give the 5800X a significant advantage in applications which care more about frequency and really not much about cache. But it also gives us an interesting like for like in architecture and in core and thread count of why and where just pure frequency doesn't always help. For reference, the R7 5700X that just came out, that plots closer to 4050 megahertz. This is the lower power version of the 5800X, so there's less power budget to boost the clock, and all of this makes sense. This chart is for a single core workload, so we're looking at max boosting frequency per interval across all cores. The R7 5800X 3D maxed out at 4450 megahertz for the entire test. The 5800X non-3D, the original, plotted at 4850 megahertz for the same workload. That's, again, a significant lead in limited thread workloads that aren't cache dependent. It won't matter much, though, obviously, if the scenario actually does want all of that cache. The 5700X ran higher as well at 4650 megahertz and could prove faster than the 5800X 3D in some specific low thread, low cache workloads. Up next, we'll cover power consumption. We test this at the EPS 12 volt cables to get a direct read on CPU power utilization before VRM efficiency losses. This is not total system power. In a Blender all-core workload, the 5800X 3D consumed about 112 watts during the test. This puts it lower than the 130 watts we measured on the 5800X. There can be two primary reasons for this. Like we saw in the 5950X versus the 5900X here, despite being higher performance and higher core count in the 5950X, there's better binning on the vCore to sustain a given frequency that contributes to the power consumption reduction we see. Additionally, reduced frequency helps bring down the power draw despite having more cores. The 5800X 3D ends up highly efficient for what it produces though. The 12900KS, for reference, is sort of the opposite of this, where it really sets the bar high at 275 watts for the same exact test when under 100% CPU load. That's over double what we saw in the 5800X 3D. The 12900KS also draws this ad infinitum, and it doesn't seem to respect tau limits, so it's just like that forever as long as there's a full workload. In Cinebench R20 multi-threaded, the 5800X 3D again plotted at about 112 watts. The 12900KS stays around 276 watts, while the 12900K, now measured within its 52-second tau boosting window, is at 240 watts. In Far Cry 6 at 1080p, there's still plenty of room for CPU scaling to determine the maximum capabilities of these parts in gaming. The 5800X3D meets AMD's claim and does manage to hit the top of the chart. It lands at 174 FPS average, and it pulls the lows up with it. 117 FPS for 1%, and although unplotted, 101 FPS average for 0.1%. These are significantly improved over just about everything else on the chart, immediately establishing the real angle for this story. Over the 12900KS that we bought for $800, we're still remembering that, the 5800X3D leads by 5.5%. That's not phenomenal, but considering it's $450 instead of $800, that's pretty good. Versus the 5800X, which launched at the same price as the X3D, it's now about $340 though, the improvement is a staggering 27%. We confirmed this result in additional retesting and with external data, and it lined up the same way. This is outside of AMD's 15% expected average claim, so this is probably an outlier, and you'll see in our testing that this doesn't happen very often, but it's a repeatable result in this game, and it bodes well for the 5800X3D in gaming. It's about the strongest start possible for this one. In Counter-Strike Go and using our test settings and scenario we used, the 5800X3D does not improve over the original 5800X for average FPS. They're about the same. At 347 FPS average, the cache doesn't appear to help with boosting the average frame rate, but the slight frequency deficit may be what puts it technically 1 to 2 FPS lower than the 5800X, although we're basically within error here. The 1% and 0.1% lows are meaningfully boosted on the 5800X3D though, surpassing everything else on the chart. To be clear, this isn't a game-changing difference in lows versus some of the other parts. They're all doing well enough in this range that we're kind of in placebo territory. But the 5800X3D does have a real and a measurable gain. The 12900KS runs at a higher average frame rate and competitive lows, especially 1% lows. The average FPS lead here is about 7%, and that 7% more only costs 78% more money. What a hell of a deal. Thanks, Intel.
Thanks, Steve.
In other words, Intel is charging about $50 per 1% increase in average FPS over the 5800X3D. It's one of the worst value propositions we've ever seen. Didn't think it could get much worse than the 3090 Ti, but here we are. The 12900K non-S is a better deal, positionally at least, at 367 FPS average, but the X3D is a close competitor and it pulls ahead in other games. It's not a technical best here, and 1% lows are within error, but it's close enough. At 1440p, the R7 5800X3D ran at 343 FPS average, so about the same place as during the 1080p testing. That's expected. We're still not GPU bound, so we're still seeing CPU differences. The rest of the scaling is about the same as the 1080p chart as well. Red Dead Redemption 2, tested with our settings, is another game with scaling all the way up to the top-end CPUs. The R7 5800X3D ran at 196 FPS average here, functionally tied with the 12900KS. We might be approaching GPU bottlenecks here as well. It's also leading the 12900K by 3.3%. The 5800X3D leads the original 5800Xs at 176 FPS average result by 11%. A substantial lead when considering the MSRP is the same for the 5800X3D as it was for the 5800X when it launched. That's a good place to be for AMD, and certainly better than what we saw from the low-end parts recently, like the 4500 trash component. The 12900KS looks like a rip-off here, and is perhaps only valuable for its binned nature for competitive overclocking. In lows, the 5800X3D was about the same as the 12900K original CPU, although a little better in 0.1%. The 5800X is not significantly different from the 5800X3D in frame time consistency in 1% and 0.1% lows, so there's no deviation there this time. GTA 5 is actually incredibly interesting here, even if you don't play it or you don't care because it's old or something. This is interesting purely because it gives us a lot of information about how CPUs behave. In this one, the 5800X3D is the first to break past the wall of 187.5 FPS average, or 5.33 milliseconds per frame. This has been the historic cap for performance in Rage, or the engine, for GTA 5. The actual average works out to 171.8 FPS when plotted against the entire test period, but the frame time plot, which we'll look at in a moment, shows that it pushes back what we thought were engine limits. In terms of the pure average, the 5800X3D leads the 12900KS by 5.5%. with 1% lows not too distant, but ahead on the 12900KS, and the 0.1% lows are about the same. The 5800X3D also leads the 5950X by 22% and the 5800X non-3D, which we just retested, by a massive 27%. We should note that this is going to be heavily dependent on game settings and test setup, but at least in GTA, we're seeing the 5800X3D breaking walls that we had previously been running into for about 5 years for results. And it didn't matter how high we clocked the RAM or the CPU. We even used liquid nitrogen and XOC for some of this testing with GTA 5, and we still ran into these limits. So it's impressive. We're also a little bit confused because it looks like all Rockstar has to do is wait around 6 or 7 years for AMD to engineer a solution to Rockstar's game engine problems. Impressive. This chart shows the frame time pacing of the 5800X3D and GTA 5 at 1080p. It's sitting right around 6 millisecond frame-to-frame intervals with occasional dips to the 5 millisecond range. This is impressive for this game specifically, and the frame-to-frame consistency is excellent here. Our biggest excursion from the average is about 2 milliseconds, so that's crazy good, and you won't notice any hitching. The 5800X also does well overall, but it plots higher. And as a reminder, lower is better here, but more consistent is best. Despite introducing more GPU load, 1440p produces the same results. We're still primarily CPU bound here, so the scaling is similar down the stack. The 5800X3D maintains its newfound lead, including besting the 12900KS. Considering Intel's previous dominance in GTA, specifically for previous generations as well, the lack of value in the 12900KS is particularly embarrassing. Total War 3 Kingdom still doesn't play well with Alder Lake E cores on Windows 10, so we had to mix in our Windows 11 data for the 12900K here. The 5800X3D leads this chart now, plotting at 216 FPS average and also leading in 1% and 0.1% lows, or frame time consistency. The rest of the AMD CPUs were previously stuck at about 205 to 207 FPS average with no testable difference between them. We were bound up elsewhere, not the GPU, clearly, because we can plot higher with these other CPUs, so it'd be memory and cache where we were stuck. The 5800X3D is able to overcome these limitations, including some of the early memory limitations, relying on cache instead. It pushes past even Intel's 12900K, which is at 214 FPS average. The lead over the original 5800X is about 4.6%. Considering the 5800X is now about $340, it's still the better deal. It's not like the rest of the market froze since the launch of the 5800X, so the prices come down obviously, but the 5800X3D is at least looking better than the more expensive Intel competition. In Cyberpunk at 1080p and with medium settings, we're completely capped by the GPU. This test is basically useless for showing CPU scaling. We built the test for our lower end CPUs, and it wasn't really intended to show stuff this high up the stack. The only reason we're showing it is to illustrate what it looks like if you're GPU bound. This is what it looks like. It's the same in theory as if you play games at 4K, for example. So for what it's worth, the 5800X3D does break past the 172 FPS average wall we were hitting previously for AMD parts here, but they all kind of look the same when you're bound up by the GPU. Not a surprise. Our Hitman 3 testing is heavy on the CPU, and that's up next. The 5800X3D ran at 191 FPS average here with low space proportional to what we see on other CPUs nearby. The 5800X3D outpaced the 5800X by 12% in average FPS, lining up with some of the previous results and plotting one of the more noteworthy gains. The 5900X is led by about 7.3%, and as for the 12900K and the 12900KS, those still hold the lead in this one. So AMD's best gaming CPU claim isn't always true. We didn't expect it to be, but they probably shouldn't have said it anyway. The 12900KS and the 12900K lead by about 7% here. Time for production workloads, and these, anywhere cache isn't heavily utilized, will show a reduction in relative performance of the 5800X3D versus the 5800X. The frequency of the 5800X will matter more there. Our Blender test is a custom-built stress test for the CPU, and it renders the GN logo from our intro animation. This is a tile-based renderer using cycles that spawns one render tile per thread present on the CPU, and it then repeats that process for each tile rendered until the entire scene is drawn. The 5800X3D required 16.7 minutes to complete, marking the 5800X non-3D as 6% faster. It needed 1 minute less time to render here. This can add up over time if you do enough of this type of work, but if you run cache-bound scenarios more frequently, then a 6% trade-off isn't too bad for the benefit in those cache-bound scenarios. The 5800X3D ends up around the same level as the 10900K and its 20 threads previously, proving both more core efficient and certainly more power efficient than the former Intel flagship. The 12900KS did the same work in just 9 minutes here, a significant reduction in time needed. It's about 46% less time required. Of course, the 5800X3D runs at 60% less power to do this, but it takes longer, so there's some back and forth between them. The 12900K non-S is up at 9.4 minutes. AMD falls behind in raw completion time here versus Intel. But more importantly, we get a reminder that if you're doing this type of workload, then the 5800X3D doesn't give you anything new that didn't already exist, even just from AMD. Adobe Premiere testing uses an aggregate scoring of filters, renders, scrubbing playback, and large footage processing. The 5800X3D scores 823 points here, allowing the 5800X original CPU a lead of 3.2%. Not a huge swing. The 5900X still maintains a significant lead at 940 points and 14% ahead of the 5800X3D. Intel, meanwhile, breaks 1,000 points and has its 12900K and KS tie in overall placement, leading the 5800X3D by 26% in Premiere test score. In Adobe Photoshop tested the same way and scored an aggregate, the 5800X3D scored 1180 points versus the 5800X's 1118 points. It's actually a 5.5% gain here. The cache helps more here than the frequency does for the 5800X, which makes it a bit different than what we saw in Blender. The score is also on par with the 5950X previously, so really not bad when considered even just in a vacuum versus AMD's other parts. Now, we're not in a vacuum, so the 12900KS leads at 1395 points, or 18% ahead of the 5800X3D. The 12900K leads by 13%, allowing Intel to maintain dominance in this test. Code compile testing is next, using Chromium as our test vehicle for the benchmark. The 5800X3D required 82 minutes to complete the compile of the Chromium codebase, while the 5800X needed 79 minutes. That's about a 3.3% reduction, and we think it's attributable to the frequency increase on the 5800X. Although our former code compile test was basically a cache benchmark, the one that we run today, this one, is more generalized and utilizes a bit of everything on the CPU. The 12900KS and 12900K have a massive lead at 47 minutes, or about 41% reduced in time required to compile the code. Of course, this is with the higher power consumption, but just being faster accounts for a lot. As for more efficient CPUs that also rank high, the 5950X is right alongside the 12900K and 12900KS. Yet it's about half the power draw of the 12900KS. In 7-zip compression testing, the 5800X3D plotted at the same place as the 5800X. They're within variants of each other at around 94K MIPS, or millions of instructions per second, and that puts the 5800X3D behind the 3900X and up. The core count benefits for the higher-end CPUs really show through in this specific test. The 12900KS improves over the 12900K's score by 4.4%, with the 12900K leading the 5800X3D by 32%. Between all of these parts, the 5800X is the best value of those discussed, with the 12900K leading in raw numbers while increasing in price. The 5800X3D isn't a good fit for this task. It does fine, but if this is mostly what you do, you should buy something else. Decompression is the same way, and that's up now. In this one, the 5800X leads the X3D by 6K MIPS, leaving the 5800X3D below the 12700K and near the 5700X. The cache just doesn't benefit it here, but the frequency certainly benefits the 5800X. So wrapping up then, it's pretty simple. In gaming, the gains versus the 5800X are pretty impressive in some games and then just lackluster in others. We saw a range of about 3% at the low end, up to a massive 26% at the high end. So different games will react to the cache differently, obviously, and the range is pretty wide. On average, it does seem like we were seeing about 11% collectively. Now, at $400 from Intel, the 12700K would be your main consideration. There's no direct $450 price point Intel option right now versus the X3D. The closest that's still high end would be the 12900K at $600, but AMD's own competition, the 5800X at $340, the 5700X at $300, those make potentially a lot of sense as a value play while still keeping the 8-core 16-thread count if you need a higher core count and thread count. If you're only gaming and you don't care as much, you're not a frame rate snob, then 5600X is still, well, 5600 now is a great deal comparatively. But to keep the cores and threads, the 5800X is starting to make sense here. The X3D is a very strong competitor for gaming-only builds. We would not recommend it really for any of the production workloads that we've tested specifically. And that's because the existing AMD CPUs like the 5800X, the 5900X just simply outdo this one because the cache doesn't really help in the production workloads that we test. Now, if you do something that does actually make use of all that cache, certain types of code compile, then obviously that's up to you to figure out. Intel's 12900K still sits at the top of a lot of the gaming charts, but it has lost ground in several of them, and it has lost rank in a couple of the ones we tested as well. So the X3D is looking good overall. We do think it's a very interesting piece of technology, and it has value in those gaming-only builds. So that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. As always, you can subscribe for more. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to grab one of our coaster packs, toolkits, or mod mats, or patreon.com/gamersnexus to help us out and get some extra videos. We'll see you all next time.